I still remember the way the courtroom went silent. The judge's face turned pale, my father's jaw clenched, and in one sentence, just one, I ended everything they'd built. It wasn't supposed to go this way. My father had spent decades controlling every narrative, every vote, every headline. But he didn't realize one thing. I'd learned from the best, my grandparents, and I knew how to fight clean when surrounded by people who played dirty. The gavel shook in the judge's hand that day, and the cameras caught everything. The father who once called me a mistake now stood trembling under fluorescent lights, exposed in front of the very people who used to cheer for him. But before we get to that moment, the one that made a federal judge resign and a congressman vanish from the spotlight, you need to know how it all began. Because this story didn't start in a courtroom. It started 27 years ago with a baby girl, a hospital room, and a man who decided that grief was easier to carry when you had someone else to blame. My name is Miranda Hayes. I was born on a Tuesday morning, and by sunset, my mother was gone. My father, Congressman Richard Hayes, decided it was my fault. That's right. He blamed an infant for his wife's death. And while he buried himself in politics, power, and photo ops, my grandparents, William and Patricia Hayes, buried their grief by raising me. They saved me. But their kindness would one day become the very weapon my father tried to use against me. You see, the day my grandfather's will was read, I thought the fight was over. In reality, it was just the opening act of a war between blood and loyalty, a war that ended in the most unlikely battlefield, a courtroom where truth became my only weapon. That's where I'll take you first, into that courtroom where betrayal wore a judge's robe and justice sat waiting in silence. When I walked in that morning, the air was thick with arrogance. Reporters lined the hallway like vultures, whispering about the congressman's family scandal. I ignored them, clutching the manila folder in my hands, the one my grandfather had once called my final chess piece. My father sat at the plaintiff's table in his navy suit, wearing that smug politician smile I'd seen 1,000 times on TV. And behind the bench, Judge Crawford, my father's old friend, adjusted his glasses, pretending this was going to be fair. The whispers began as soon as I took my seat. That's her, the granddaughter who stole the inheritance. I kept my chin high. I wasn't here to defend my reputation. I was here to defend my grandfather's last wish. When the hearing began, my father's lawyer stood and performed the role of a lifetime. He painted me as manipulative, said I'd taken advantage of a frail old man, that I'd used emotional influence to cut my father out of his rightful inheritance. And every time he spoke, the judge nodded, like a puppet synchronized to the rhythm of corruption. But I didn't flinch. I'd seen this performance coming. Because when your father spends a lifetime lying to win elections, you learn how to read the script. When our turn came, my lawyer, Mr. Peterson, presented the truth. Medical records proving my grandfather's sharp mind, letters, witnesses, every detail carefully documented. Still, I could see it. The way the judge's attention faded. He wasn't listening to evidence. He was waiting for his cue. So, I gave it to him. I rose slowly, folder in hand, and asked to speak. The judge hesitated. "Ms. Hayes, your lawyer has already—" "I understand, Your Honor," I said calmly, "but there's something you need to see before you rule." The moment I placed that first photograph on the table, the one of my father and Judge Crawford laughing together at a fundraiser, the room shifted. The judge froze. My father's smirk vanished. And for the first time in my life, I had their full attention. Because this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about corruption, friendship disguised as justice, and a daughter who was about to tear it all down. People like to say childhood memories fade, that over time the details blur. Not for me. Every moment of my childhood is carved into my memory, not because it was perfect, but because it was the opposite of what it should have been. I grew up in a beautiful old house, surrounded by love, but haunted by absence. My grandparents, Patricia and William Hayes, gave me the kind of childhood that money can't buy. Bedtime stories, birthday cakes, endless encouragement. But there was always one empty chair at the table, my father's. When I was 5, I asked why he never came home. My grandmother froze mid-stir, wooden spoon still in her hand, eyes glistening. "He's very busy helping people, sweetheart," she said softly. "He works in Washington." Even at 5, I knew that was a lie. Because helping people doesn't look like missing birthdays. It doesn't sound like silence. And it sure doesn't feel like being forgotten. Every holiday, Grandpa would call him. I'd watch his hands shake as he dialed. Sometimes he'd leave a message. Most times, he'd hang up before the line even rang. I think that was his way of protecting us, saving us from hearing my father's voice filled with excuses. So instead, Grandpa became my father figure. He read me bedtime stories about courage and integrity. Grandma taught me how to paint and to always make beauty from pain. They filled the gaps my father left, and for years I convinced myself I didn't need him. But deep down, a small part of me, the naive part, still hoped one day he'd walk through that door and say, "I'm sorry, I was wrong." He never did. Instead, he sent assistants, Christmas gifts with tags that said, "From Dad," written in a stranger's handwriting. Birthday cards signed with his printed name, not his pen. The only real thing about them was the smell of expensive cologne clinging to the envelopes, like he wanted to remind us he still existed, but only in the most superficial way possible. By the time I turned 16, I stopped pretending I didn't care. It was the year I saw him on TV, giving a speech about the importance of family values. I stood there, frozen, watching the man who'd abandoned me use family as a campaign slogan. When he smiled for the cameras, something in me broke. That night, I asked my grandparents the question they'd both been dreading. Why does he hate me? Grandpa put down his newspaper and looked at me like I was glass. Your father doesn't hate you, sweetheart, he said carefully. He's complicated. I remember slamming my hands on the table. For 16 years? That's not complicated. That's cruel. Grandma started to cry quietly. That's when I realized they'd spent my entire life trying to protect me from the truth. My father wasn't busy. He just didn't care. So I stopped asking about him, stopped waiting for him, and started focusing on the two people who had actually shown up. When I graduated high school, Grandpa was in the front row, crying. Grandma had her old camcorder recording every shaky moment. My father's seat? Empty. Not even a letter, not even a call. It was that day I learned the first real lesson about family. It's not the people who share your blood. It's the people who show up when no one else will. Still, I didn't know then that his absence, his coldness, wasn't the end of the story. It was just the foundation of something bigger. Because one day, the same man who couldn't bother to make a phone call would try to take everything from me in a courtroom. And when that day came, I wouldn't just defend myself. I'd defend the people who raised me. And I'd make sure he finally understood what family values really meant. If love could be measured in consistency, then my grandparents were the richest people alive. They didn't just raise me, they built me, brick by brick, habit by habit, value by value. While other kids spent weekends at sleepovers or malls, I spent mine in Grandpa's study, watching him work through contracts and business reports. He ran his company with quiet discipline, never loud, never boastful, just firm, fair, and kind. And every so often, he'd pause and look at me over his glasses and say, "Miranda, remember this. Money should serve you, not own you." At the time, I didn't understand how much weight that sentence carried. But later, it would become the armor I wore against my father's greed. Grandma, on the other hand, was the heart of the house. She believed in beauty, in finding meaning in small things. Every morning she'd hum as she painted flowers in watercolor, sunlight spilling over her hands. She'd always make room for me at her table, handing me a brush. "Don't just copy what you see," she'd whisper. "Paint what you feel." That was her philosophy for life. Lead with empathy, even when the world doesn't deserve it. It's funny. I think she always knew that one day I'd be tested on that lesson. Our home was peaceful, filled with laughter and learning. We didn't have fancy dinners or extravagant vacations, but we had something better: presents. Grandpa never missed a school recital, even when I was terrible on the piano. He'd clap louder than anyone, and Grandma would proudly hand out cookies to the parents, bragging like I'd just played at Carnegie Hall. Every Christmas, they'd still call my father, hoping, begging, believing he'd answer. He never did, but they never stopped trying. I think that's what broke them the most. Not his silence, but their hope. They believed he was redeemable, that love, if given long enough, would change him. They were wrong. Still, their faith in people became my blueprint for compassion. It's what made me kind, but it's also what nearly destroyed me later. Because when someone grows up in love, they assume everyone plays by the same rules until they meet someone who doesn't. By the time I turned 21, I'd followed in Grandpa's footsteps. Business major, straight A student, and a scholarship to Duke. They threw a celebration dinner when I graduated. Crystal glasses, home-cooked food, tears of pride. My father didn't show up, of course. He sent a typed congratulations card signed by his assistant. Even then, I didn't feel anger, just exhaustion. I stopped waiting for him to change. Instead, I focused on becoming someone my grandparents could be proud of. And they were. Grandpa would say, "You've got Patricia's heart and my stubbornness. That's a dangerous combination." He was right. But life has a cruel way of testing the things we love most. Because not long after that perfect graduation night, I started noticing small changes. Grandma forgetting things, losing her keys, repeating stories. At first, we joked about it. Senior moments, she'd say, laughing. But then she began forgetting the names of people she'd known for decades. Once she left the stove on for hours. Another time, she asked when my mother was coming home. That's when I realized this wasn't about age. It was about loss, not of time, of herself. We took her to the doctor, and the diagnosis shattered our world. Early onset Alzheimer's. There's no sound quieter than the moment hope breaks. Grandpa just sat there, gripping her hand, tears spilling silently down his face. And I remember thinking, this woman had spent her whole life giving light to everyone else, and now hers was slowly dimming. That day, I promised her something. "I'll take care of you," I said, even as she smiled, like she didn't want to burden me. She whispered, "Live your life, sweetheart. Don't waste it on me." But she didn't understand. My life was hers. She'd given it meaning. So I quit my job offer, moved back home, and became her caretaker, not because I had to, but because love demanded it. What I didn't know was that my choice to stay, to protect, to serve would be used years later as ammunition against me. My father would twist that act of love into a weapon in court, calling it manipulation. But at that time, I wasn't thinking about revenge or inheritance. I was thinking about how to keep my grandmother safe, while watching my grandfather slowly crumble beside her. The years that followed were both the longest and the shortest of my life. Time has a strange way of stretching when you're waiting for someone you love to remember you again. Some mornings, Grandma would wake up clear and radiant, humming as she made coffee, asking about my day, laughing like the world was still the same. Other mornings, she'd look at me with frightened eyes, as if I were a stranger standing in her kitchen. "Who are you?" she whispered once, trembling. I smiled through tears. "I'm Miranda, Grandma, your granddaughter." She reached out, tracing my face with her hand as if searching for recognition that just wouldn't come. "I used to have a granddaughter," she murmured softly. "She had your eyes. Those were the days that broke me, but I never let her see my pain. Because she had carried me through my worst years, it was my turn to carry hers through hers." Grandpa was there every step of the way, though I could see the toll it took on him. He'd been a man of structure, of logic and order, but this, watching his wife fade before him, was chaos. I often found him standing at the kitchen sink, staring out the window long after the dishes were done. Sometimes he'd whisper her name like a prayer. He tried everything: new medications, memory exercises, old songs from their youth, but nothing could slow what was coming. And through it all, one thing stayed constant: my father's silence.
Grandpa called him dozens of times. He left voicemails, wrote letters, even begged him to visit before it's too late. But my father, the congressman who gave speeches about family unity, always had an excuse: important meetings, legislative sessions, fundraisers. Too busy for the woman who gave him life. I stopped hoping he'd show up, but Grandpa never stopped. The night before Grandma passed, he sat by her bedside, holding her hand and telling her stories about their first date, the same story he'd told me 100 times. And I swear, for a moment, I saw a spark of her old self in her eyes. She smiled faintly and whispered, "Tell Richard I'm proud of him." I felt the tears burn before they fell, because even on her deathbed, she still believed her son could change. She died the next morning, quietly, peacefully, holding my hand. I felt her last breath leave like a soft sigh. When we called my father, he didn't even answer. 3 days later, he returned Grandpa's call, not to offer condolences, but to ask about the lake house, the same lake house that had belonged to Grandma's family for generations. "She's not even buried yet," Grandpa said, his voice shaking with fury. There was silence on the other end, then my father's calm political tone: "I just want to make sure things are handled properly." That's when I heard it, the sound of something breaking inside my grandfather. For 30 years, he'd made excuses for his son. That call erased every single one. I was standing in the doorway when he slammed the phone down so hard the desk cracked. Then he said words I'd never heard from him before. "He'll get nothing, not a dime, not from me, not from her, nothing." He turned to me, face red with rage and heartbreak. "Miranda," he said, voice trembling, "don't ever let people like him tell you what family means. He's lost that right." That night, the house felt different, emptier, heavier. I heard him crying for the first time in my life. And for the first time, I cried not for my grandmother's death, but for the man she'd left behind. Over the next months, Grandpa moved through the house like a ghost. He'd sit in her chair, stare at her paintings, talk to her photo every morning. His grief aged him faster than time ever could. But even in his sadness, he was still planning, quietly, deliberately. I'd catch glimpses of it: private meetings with his lawyer, documents he'd hide when I entered the room. When I asked, he'd smile and say, "Just making sure things are in order for you, sweetheart." I didn't think much of it. I trusted him completely. But he was building something far bigger than I realized:
a final act of love and a final lesson in justice. The year after Grandma's funeral, Grandpa and I grew even closer. He taught me everything he knew about business and survival, the same way he'd once taught me multiplication and manners. But this time, it felt urgent, like he was passing down a legacy. "The most important thing I can teach you," he said one evening, "is that loyalty must be earned, not inherited." At the time, I didn't understand why he said it with tears in his eyes. A few months later, I would. Because by the time he passed away, the papers were already signed, the plan already sealed, and my father's downfall had quietly been written into the final page of my grandfather's will. Grief changes people in strange ways. Some become quieter, some lash out. But my grandfather, he became strategic. After Grandma's funeral, I noticed him transform from broken widower to silent architect. He'd spend hours in his study with Mr. Peterson, his lawyer, the door shut tight. When I asked what they were working on, he'd give me the same answer every time. "Just some paperwork, sweetheart, nothing important." But his eyes said otherwise. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me, really looking, with that same thoughtful intensity he used when evaluating business deals, except this time the deal was me. He wasn't measuring profits, he was measuring trust. He started teaching me things I didn't think I'd ever need to know: how to read corporate filings, how to negotiate, how to protect intellectual property, even how to recognize when someone's smiling while planning to stab you in the back. At the time, it felt random. In hindsight, it was training. He'd say, "When power changes hands, Miranda, people show who they really are. Promise me you'll be ready when that happens." I promised, not realizing just how literal that warning would become. Over the next few months, his health declined. He was still sharp as a blade mentally, but physically, he grew tired faster. He took shorter walks, skipped meals, and sometimes stared at Grandma's photo like he was trying to memorize her face before joining her. Then one morning, I found him asleep in his favorite chair. Coffee cold, newspaper unread, his reading glasses still on. Except he wasn't asleep. He was gone. The paramedics said it was peaceful, heart failure in his sleep. No pain, no struggle. But when you lose the last person who truly saw you, peaceful feels like a cruel word. The house was so silent that day, I could hear the clock ticking in the hall. I wanted to call my father, to tell him his own father was gone, but then I remembered all the unanswered calls, the excuses, the years of indifference. I called Mr. Peterson instead. "I'll be right there," he said, voice tight but steady. "And Miranda, don't call anyone else yet, please." Within an hour, he arrived with a thick envelope sealed with my grandfather's initials. He sat across from me in the same room where Grandpa had died, hands folded like a man about to deliver both a gift and a burden. "Your grandfather," he began, "was a very thorough man. He anticipated this moment, and he wanted you to be protected." "Protected from what?" I asked. Mr. Peterson sighed. "From your father." The words didn't surprise me, but the gravity in his tone did. Inside the envelope was a letter written in my grandfather's handwriting.
It started the way all his letters did. My dearest Miranda. But the rest wasn't gentle. It was calculated, deliberate, final. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. Richard will soon learn that actions have consequences.
I've left everything, every asset, every company, every property to you. Not because of bloodline, but because of loyalty. He chose power over family. You chose love over pride. When he challenges this, and he will, remember this truth. The best revenge is living well. And never let his bitterness infect your peace. I folded the letter slowly, heart pounding. For the first time in my life, I realized my grandfather hadn't just loved me, he'd trusted me to finish his unfinished war. A week later, the will was read in Mr. Peterson's office. The room smelled like polished wood and expensive fear. I arrived early, calm but alert. Then the door opened, and in walked my father, Congressman Richard Hayes, immaculate as always, his suit perfect, his expression composed, but his eyes cold and calculating. He said, "Miranda, I'm sorry about Dad. You must be devastated." I said nothing. He called him Dad, not father, like the word family was just another prop for his performance. When Mr. Peterson began reading the will, the tone of the room shifted instantly. Grandpa had left charitable donations, college funds for staff families, all thoughtful, meticulous. And then came the part everyone was waiting for. To my son, Richard Hayes, I leave my disappointment in the man he became. The silence that followed was heavy. My father's face turned red, then white, then a color I'd never seen before, pure fury. To my granddaughter, Miranda Hayes, I leave my entire estate, all properties, investments, businesses, and assets shall transfer to her immediately upon my death. I could practically feel my father's blood boiling beside me. His lawyer shot up like he'd been electrocuted. "This will is invalid," he barked, "clearly the product of manipulation." But Mr. Peterson was ready. He opened another envelope, thick with documents. "Your father anticipated this argument," he said calmly. "We have medical records, psychological evaluations, video statements, and multiple witnesses verifying his competence." Then he turned to me. "And this," he added softly, "was meant for you to read after your father hears the will." It was another letter, shorter this time. "My darling girl, you've earned this. Don't let him take what he didn't value when he had it. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard, but sometimes it needs to fight." When I looked up, my father wasn't the congressman anymore. He wasn't even a man. He was a storm, one that had just realized the wind wasn't in his favor. That was the day I stopped being his forgotten daughter and became his greatest threat. You'd think that after hearing his father's will, after being disowned so publicly, my dad would have disappeared quietly, swallowed his pride, and moved on. But pride was the only thing he had left, and wounded pride, it's more dangerous than a loaded gun. Within 48 hours, the war had begun. It started with whispers, reporters calling, pretending to fact-check rumors about the inheritance, articles appearing online about family conflict, painting me as a greedy granddaughter who'd manipulated a frail old man. And somehow, every outlet used the same phrasing. Insiders allege undue influence. Classic political maneuver. You can always tell when it's orchestrated. Same tone, same language, same convenient timing. Mr. Peterson called it immediately. He's trying to shape public opinion, he said grimly. By the time we're in court, people will already think you're guilty. He was right. Camera vans began parking outside my house. Reporters shouted questions when I stepped outside to get the mail. Miranda, did you pressure your grandfather to change his will? Do you feel guilty taking money from your father? I didn't answer. I knew better than to feed them sound bites. But inside, I was boiling. The man who'd ignored me my entire life was now obsessed with destroying me. Next came the legal attacks. Motion after motion filed by his legal team, each one more invasive than the last. They wanted my college records, my medical history, even my therapy notes from when Grandma died. They wanted to find anything that could make me look unstable or unfit. But here's the thing. I'd been raised by William Hayes, and William Hayes didn't raise fools. I had records, every document, every receipt, every doctor's note, meticulously organized. So every time they came after me, I had proof ready before they even asked. Still, the pressure was relentless. Social media flooded with fake stories. Miranda Hayes stole her dying grandfather's estate. Congressman's daughter under investigation for elder abuse. I remember one night sitting on the floor of my living room, phone buzzing nonstop, camera flashes flickering through my windows. I asked myself, why? Why is he doing this? And then I realized it wasn't about money. It was about control. He couldn't stand that I'd won something he couldn't manipulate. But the more he attacked, the more something inside me hardened. If he wanted a war, fine. But he'd forgotten. I was my grandfather's granddaughter. And Grandpa always said, when someone fights dirty, don't outscream them, outsmart them. That chance came when I saw the newspaper photo. It was a fundraiser picture, my father grinning with a group of local dignitaries, and right beside him, Judge Martin Crawford, the same man assigned to our inheritance case. The caption read,
Old law school friends reunite at charity gala. My stomach dropped. I'd heard of Crawford before, a community pillar, longtime family friend, political ally. And now, he was the one who'd decide whether I'd keep my inheritance or lose everything. My father had set the stage perfectly. A friendly judge, a sympathetic media, a daughter already branded as manipulative. For most people, that would have been checkmate. But Grandpa taught me something about chess. You can always win if you're patient enough to let your opponent make the first mistake. I started digging. Every photo, every article, every campaign donor list. And sure enough, there it was, a trail of pictures spanning over 15 years, fundraisers, dinners, family events, even vacations. My father and Judge Crawford side by side in every one. These weren't professional acquaintances. They were friends. Friends who shared power, secrets, and favors. Friends who smiled for cameras while pretending to serve justice. I printed everything, organized it chronologically, built a timeline so tight that even a defense attorney couldn't spin it. When I showed it to Mr. Peterson, his eyes widened. This is gold, but we have to be careful. Judges hate being accused of bias. I'm not accusing him. I'm just going to let his own actions speak for him. From that moment, I stopped feeling like a victim. The fear evaporated because now I had leverage. For the next 2 weeks, I stayed quiet, publicly calm, privately preparing. While my father's team ramped up their media assault, I was building the counterstrike that would end both his career and Crawford's. The night before the hearing, I sat alone in Grandpa's study, his chair still smelling faintly of old books and aftershave. I spread the photos across the desk. Fundraiser smiles, gala handshakes, charity galas. Each image was a nail in the coffin of corruption. Then I whispered out loud, "Don't worry, Grandpa. Tomorrow, they'll finally see who he really is." The morning of the hearing felt like stepping onto a battlefield, except my weapons weren't bullets or blades. They were truth, evidence, and the calm my grandfather had taught me to master. The courthouse was already surrounded by reporters when I arrived. Flashbulbs burst like lightning as I walked through the crowd. "Miranda, did you manipulate your grandfather? Do you have a statement about your father's lawsuit?" I said nothing. Silence is louder than denial when you wear it like armor. Inside the courtroom, I took my seat beside Mr. Peterson. The air was thick, anticipation mixed with arrogance. Across the room, my father sat at the plaintiff's table, perfectly pressed suit, American flag pin gleaming under the lights. He looked every bit the grieving son wronged by an ungrateful daughter. And behind the bench sat Judge Crawford, face unreadable, eyes calculating. When the gavels struck, the performance began. My father's lawyer stood first, weaving a story so polished it could have won an Oscar. He painted my grandfather as a vulnerable old man manipulated by emotional dependency. He claimed I'd isolated him, influenced him, played the devoted granddaughter to secure his wealth. Each word was carefully chosen to sting, like venom delivered in polite English. The crowd murmured, reporters scribbling every word. And Judge Crawford? He nodded, over and over, nodding as if his mind was already made up. Mr. Peterson leaned toward me and whispered, "We knew this would happen. Stay calm." I nodded. I was calm, because I already knew how this act would end. When it was our turn, Mr. Peterson presented our evidence. Medical evaluations proving Grandpa's mental sharpness until the very end. Video statements confirming his wishes. Witnesses, doctors, business partners, all testifying to his clarity. But Crawford barely looked up. He checked his watch. He flipped through papers. It was theater, and the ending had been rehearsed. Until I changed the script. "Your Honor," Mr. Peterson said, "before you rule, my client wishes to address the court directly." Crawford frowned. "Miss Hayes, this is highly irregular." "I understand," I said, standing, "but so is what's happening in this courtroom." A ripple of murmurs filled the room. Even my father tilted his head slightly, smirking. He thought this was desperation, that I'd crack under pressure. Poor man. He'd spent his life underestimating me. I reached into my folder and pulled out a single photograph, glossy, recent. It showed my father and Judge Crawford laughing together at a political fundraiser. The judge's hand on my father's shoulder, champagne glasses raised mid-toast. "This," I said, clearly, holding it up so everyone could see, "was taken 3 months ago at Congressman Hayes's fundraiser. It appears you, Your Honor, were a guest of honor." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters leaned forward like predators scenting blood. Crawford's face drained of color. He said, "Professional acquaintance, nothing more." I smiled. Professional acquaintances don't attend each other's family dinners. I pulled out another photo, then another. 15 years of evidence. Campaign rallies, charity galas, private dinners. Every photo told the same story. 2 men tied by friendship, politics, and favors. I spread them across the defense table. "Your Honor, these images show a personal relationship spanning more than a decade, a relationship that, by legal definition, compromises your ability to remain impartial." Crawford's gavel slammed. "Miss Hayes, this is—" "Evidence," I interrupted, voice steady. "Publicly documented, verifiable, undeniable evidence." The courtroom erupted. Camera shutters clicked like gunfire. My father's lawyer jumped up, shouting objections drowned by the chaos. And then my father made his fatal mistake. He stood, face crimson, fists trembling, and pointed at me across the room. "This girl only knows how to waste what she doesn't deserve," he shouted. Crawford nodded before he could stop himself. And in that single, reflexive gesture, his career ended. The room fell silent. Reporters froze mid-note. Mr. Peterson's eyebrows lifted slightly, like he'd just watched a man throw himself off a cliff. I took a step forward, voice calm, but sharp enough to cut marble. "Let me say this plainly, Your Honor. If you act favorably toward him, I'll release every photo, every article, every record proving your friendship, and I'll send them directly to the State Judicial Review Board. You can't be both judge and friend." The silence that followed could have split stone. The judge's hand shook on the gavel. His face turned the color of chalk. We are not friends," he stammered. "Then prove it," I said quietly. He swallowed, eyes darting between me and my father.
Then he looked down at the will in front of him. "The evidence is clear," he said finally, voice trembling. "William Hayes was of sound mind. His wishes are valid. The inheritance stands." He struck the gavel so hard it echoed through the walls. Case dismissed. And just like that, it was over. Crawford bolted from the bench, pale and shaking. Reporters exploded into movement, shouting questions, recording, texting editors. My father sat frozen, the reality settling into his bones. When he finally stood, he didn't look angry. He looked hollow. "You've destroyed everything I built," he whispered. I met his eyes and said, "No, Dad, I exposed what you built on lies." Then I turned and walked out of that courtroom, not as the accused, not as the daughter, but as the heir of two people who taught me what integrity really means. When I walked out of that courthouse, the sunlight felt different. It wasn't just light, it was liberation. For the first time in years, the weight on my chest was gone. Reporters swarmed, microphones flashing like weapons. But I didn't flinch. I didn't need to speak. The story had already spoken for itself. That evening, the news cycle exploded. Headlines everywhere. Congressman's case collapses amid conflict of interest scandal. Judge Crawford steps down pending investigation. Miranda Hayes wins legal battle. Family feud exposes corruption. By nightfall, my father's political career was over. Campaign donors withdrew, advisors resigned. His carefully crafted image, the devoted family man, the community leader, crumbled in less than 24 hours. The irony? He had spent decades chasing power, yet lost everything to the one person he'd underestimated most. But victory didn't feel the way I expected. It wasn't fireworks or champagne. It was silence, clean, final, and oddly peaceful. A week later, I received a single envelope in the mail, no return address. Inside was a note in my father's handwriting. "You were right. I forgot what family means. I hope one day you can forgive me, not for what I did to you, but for what I became." There was no apology big enough to fix the years of absence, the pain, the greed. But for the first time, it didn't matter, because forgiveness wasn't for him, it was for me. I folded the letter, placed it in my grandfather's desk, and whispered, "I forgive you, but I'll never forget." In the months that followed, I rebuilt quietly. I restored Grandpa's old company, but not for profit, for purpose. I turned it into a scholarship foundation in both their names, the William and Patricia Hayes Legacy Fund. It helps young people who grew up the way I did, overlooked, underestimated, but capable of greatness if someone just believes in them. Every year, I write a letter to each scholarship recipient, not from the founder, but from someone who understands. And every evening, I still sit in Grandpa's study. The sunlight spills across the old desk, catching the silver edges of his picture frame. In it, Grandma is painting,
Soft smile, hair tied back, and Grandpa is standing behind her, pretending to critique her work while secretly admiring her. They were my true inheritance, their strength, their decency, their love. Everything else was just paperwork.
Sometimes I think about my father, where he is, what he does, whether he still tells himself he was the victim. But I don't dwell on it, because some battles aren't meant to be won through destruction. They're meant to end through peace. And peace, that's what my grandfather wanted for me all along. Before he died, he wrote one last line at the bottom of his letter, a sentence I didn't fully understand until that day in court. Justice isn't about revenge, my dear. It's about balance. Make the scales even, then walk away. And I did. I walked away. Not rich from money, but rich from closure, rich from freedom, rich from the legacy of love stronger than greed. So, if you ask me today what I said in court that left the judge pale and my dad silent, I'll tell you this. It wasn't just a line. It was a lifetime of lessons condensed into one truth. You can't bury integrity with lies. Because the truth, no matter how long it sleeps, always wakes up. And when it does, it speaks louder than power, money, or fear ever could. Some people inherit wealth. Others inherit wounds. But if you're lucky, truly lucky, you inherit wisdom. And wisdom, that's the kind of fortune no court can ever take away.